Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Yasmine Mohammed podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today for our conversation with Chama. Chama was born into a Muslim Jewish family in Morocco. She's dedicated her career to creating safe spaces for dialogue and bridging the gaps between Muslim and Jewish narratives, as well as Eastern and Western values. Wow, big jobs. Both of those are really, really big jobs. And you're obviously a very unique person, perfectly placed to do these two jobs. Um, so welcome, Chama. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Yasmine, for having me. I'm constantly inspired by you and empowered by your voice. So thank you for sharing your platform with me.
My absolute pleasure. Um, so let's start at the beginning. I really want to know, as soon as you said I'm Muslim and Jewish and I grew up in Morocco, I was like, I need to read more about this girl. I need to understand. I mean, I know Morocco is probably on the scale of anti-Semitism in the Arab world. Morocco is actually one of the best. But that doesn't mean that it is, of course, without many failures. Um, so tell me your experience. First of all, who's Muslim, who's Jewish from your parents? And tell me about growing up in Morocco and what that meant in the society, like how people treated you, how you identified yourself. Did you identify as a Muslim? Did you identify as a Jew? Tell me everything about your childhood.
Totally. Thank you for that question because it helps frame everything else. So my name is Chama. For those of you who don't know me, I grew up in Casablanca, Morocco. My mother is from the north of Morocco, Tangier. My father is originally from Essaouira in the south, but grew up in Casablanca in the Jewish quarter. And my mother is Muslim, my father is Jewish, which meant that in a way, early on, I just was not allowed to belong in any spiritual religious space because through Islam, the religion is transferred through the father, and in Judaism, it's transferred through the mother. So I was in this sort of void. But I would say my belonging is something that I questioned very early on, even without really understanding how Jewish my father is. It took me a really long time to actually unravel his own story because he had gone through so much self-censorship and internalized anti-Semitism due to multiple experiences with Jewish persecution. And so it took me a long time to really understand the identities that were at play within my own household. And therefore, I think by extension, the identities that played out and that shaped not just Morocco, but North Africa and the Middle East region as a whole, and to understand why some identities were more represented than others, and to also understand why and how I was code switching, switching all the time, and for what reasons, and which languages, which identities gave me power, and which others took away my power and agency. And I think being a woman on top of these layers just gives you this acute sensitivity to identity politics in general. So I grew up very much in this sort of confused state of questioning when I was younger, because clearly our family was different than the rest of the community. And those things came to the surface a lot more as I grew older. So, you hit puberty, now you notice that there is some type of policing outside the household that I'm not going through at home. So, for example, something that really stood out to me was when I, first became a teenager and sort of, you're developing into the body of a young woman. I remember being like very self-conscious about that and buying like a cover up for the first time in my life to cover my bathing suit. And my dad being so offended that I covered my body and like shrunk and like minimized myself. And he basically like sent my brother on the beach to like snatched the cover up away from my body. And they were just basically like playing volleyball with it. And in that moment, I realized there's something happening here where when I'm outside of the household, I am met with all this like religious extremism and policing. And everyone's telling me to sort of stick to my role as a woman and to cover up and to veil and to conceal. And I just realized, wait, but my father is different. How come he's different? Where does he get his sort of secularism from? Where does he get these liberal values from? And my mom, I would say, is spiritual. So today she wears a hijab, and I think that it's also due to this these multiple decades of Islamization in the region, and the pressure to conform to what is set as the standard for what an honorable woman should look like.
So she didn't wear hijab when you were growing up then?
No,
Okay.
she was in a two-piece bikini and then a one-piece bikini. And I think if you look at even like our grandmothers, and if you look at pictures of not just Morocco, but obviously Iran and Iraq and countries across the region, you look at pictures from the 50s and 60s and 70s, it was very different. And we can speak to the sort of moderate Arab feminism and feminist movements that surfaced then and sort of how centralized that movement was, but it was still kind of bearing fruit on a day-to-day basis in society and in women's rights. But slowly and surely and very effectively, Islamization made its way across the region and beyond. I remember being in Sri Lanka a few years ago and noticing women in Sri Lanka in not just abayas, but like full-on niqabs. And I remember being so confused, but also thinking, what a loss of culture, of richness, of just multitudes of cultures that we've had in this region and have slowly started to disappear. So I was very conscious of these things and very conscious of radicalism and Islamization because it was all around me. It was in the school where I went, it was in the souk, it was in the conversations on the media, it was in the TV channels that were sponsored by Gulf states. And because it was already having this impact on society, I was always in the state of trying to make sense of what is happening around me. Because at home, we could discuss everything. And even with my mom, who obviously identifies as Muslim and believes in Islam, I would have all these beautiful conversations with my mom. In middle school, I became very staunchly atheist, and I had a very big romance with existentialism. And so I would come back home from like Islamic education class or philosophy class and have these like fiery debates with my mother. And she would say, let's sit down and look at what the scripture is saying and try to understand what each verse meant, instead of saying, no, how dare you? And that was a unique experience that I had, because when I talked about it with my peers at school and, I went through the Moroccan national curriculum. And so when I would have these conversations about what was happening at home, people would look at me like, this is an interesting household you live in, where you're allowed to ask these questions, where you don't get slapped in the face for saying that God doesn't exist, and for challenging all these beliefs. But I'll tell you, in terms of my Jewish identity, so I have very much a Jewish Moroccan last name. My grandfather moving up to Casablanca from a Jewish village in the south of Morocco, had to get a sort of a national ID under French colonial rule at the time. And they added a T to our last name, which used to be Mechtaly. And so with that, talk about the layers of disposition and disconnection and rupture that happened due to colonialism, which is, I think, really interesting given how Jews are framed globally as colonizers, when we also
These are the second, like first they were colonized by the Arabs, then by the French. Yeah.
Yes, and so many others.
Yeah.
go back to the Romans and the Vandals and
Mhm.
all of that.
Mhm.
But basically, I would be in school and people would try to make sense of my identity because I showed up in ways that looked more secular. And I showed up with, I would say, a lot of agency, a lot of fire, like asking questions and challenging everyone. And was very much okay with my atheism, and so much that I used to identify as a new atheist as well, and discovered Sam Harris and the school of new atheism very young, and I felt really empowered by the questions they were posing. And I would take them to public school in Morocco, and people would just kind of ask all these questions around, how come you're saying that God doesn't exist? How come you're challenging some things that the prophet said? And my schedule at the time was really interesting because I would get out of Islamic education class straight into philosophy class. And so I would get out very much burning with questions. And I would just say them in class. And after class, I would get like surrounded by basically like mobs of students, my peers, who would say that was offensive. How dare you? You're going to hell. And just like try to intimidate me, which is why today, with all of the sort of hate online, I always just say, this is not new to me. I've been through
Mhm.
hate offline.
Now,
Kind of,
I really have to, I'm just going to pause for 1 second and rewind a little bit. So you're getting pushback from your peers for speaking up about your beliefs that your lack of beliefs in Islam. Um, but did you get pushback from your peers because of the fact that your father is Jewish? Was that something that you grew up with?
yeah. So I was not comfortable telling people that my father is ethnically Jewish. And I wasn't comfortable with kind of sharing the story of my grandfather, but I was doing essentially Jewish activism and fighting for Jewish inclusion since I was a kid. And as a teenager, I got into a lot of trouble for doing this work. And in middle school and high school, particularly in high school, where there was a lot more extremism and just lack of tolerance for difference, it was something I felt on a constant basis. And it wasn't just from my peers, it was from the teachers and the principals in school. So I'll give you some examples. Every time I would bring up Jewish history in class, my teachers would like subtract grades from my exams because how dare you talk about Jewish identity, because they almost frame it as an avenue of dividing um, the ethnic communities that make up Morocco or make up North Africa. They call it
Oh,
a colonial tactic to divide and conquer. So I was kind of
so they were nationalists. You're Moroccan and that's it, regardless of your religion or.
And it's much more than that. You're Moroccan and you're not supposed to so sorry about that. You're Moroccan and you're not supposed to question what that even means because you really can't even begin to understand Moroccan history without Jewish Moroccan history. It's so interconnected that it's really impossible to make sense of the development of not just Moroccan cultural identity, but national identity without Jewish history. And so I refused and constantly pushed not just for Jewish history, but the intersections of Jewish and indigenous histories in North Africa. And I think that's where a lot of trouble came in for me and why I was constantly being attacked in high school and just kind of clearly told that I don't belong. Because when you talk about indigeneity and Jewishness as interconnected, it challenges the claims of identity for everyone else who is not
Right.
in, which is anyone and everyone who claims to be Arab in the Maghreb,
Mm-hmm.
because the Maghreb is not Arab. And
Mm-hmm.
there was obviously, the impact of Pan-Arabism as a movement on the post-colonial identity formation
Mm-hmm.
across the region. And that was deep. And it happened through music and culture and religion. So challenging that, bringing up Jewish indigeneity, or the stories of the Amazigh indigenous communities
Mm-hmm.
North Africa, who are the original inhabitants, the natives to North Africa, who were there when the Umayyad Islamist conquest of North Africa happened in the 7th century, who fought for 100 years.
Yeah.
And all of these layers of history are actually not represented at all in our national curriculum.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of why people really in the Middle East and North Africa struggle to even hear the Jewish conversation or the sort of Zionist or the indigenous rights conversation, is because they weren't taught in school. They
Mm-hmm.
were taught this like la la land of a story that,
Or they were taught lies, basically.
yes,
Yeah.
and that
They were,
when Islam came into North Africa, it was just embraced by everyone.
yeah. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it was challenged a lot because of my Jewishness, because of my secularism, because of my atheism, because of my feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think that the first thing that made me become much more vocal about Jewish and Indigenous history was stumbling upon the story of this Jewish queen from the 7th century named Kahina, who allegedly was a Kohen from the Kohanim. So she was a high priestess, and she had the ability to kind of see things before they happened. And she was a military leader, political leader who mobilized and organized tribes around her to fight the Umayyad invasions of North Africa in the 7th century. And she fought them off for about 20 years until they beheaded her and sent her head to Damascus and forcibly converted her children. In fact, some stories say that she told her own kids to convert so that they can have a chance of staying alive. And so finding that story at a young age pretty much radicalized me
Mm-hmm.
because I existed outside of our home. I existed in all these spaces that were constantly telling me to minimize myself, to shrink my identities, and to strip away my agency and my voice as first a woman and second a Jew and third a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
It's like all of the layers, right? And so I refused. And I said, I'm going to teach everyone around me about this woman's story. Because if you tell people about her story, what you're doing is you're telling them that, first of all, this area was so culturally, ethnically, religiously diverse. Second, that women had different roles, and women can be military leaders and political leaders and can fight wars for 20 years. And that they are the ones who kind of call the shots.
I'm gonna pause. I have to ask you a question because an Amazigh woman from Tunisia told me a very similar story about a queen. Now, is this the same woman and and it's the Amazigh area, which included Tunisia at the time,
It could be
or
other
is
women.
somebody else?
Could
Okay.
be, could be her, it could be others. So Kahina was originally from like modern day Algeria. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
these
Mm-hmm.
constructs of modern
Yeah,
states were very
of
different
course.
then.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another woman who ruled over the Tuareg people, who are also a subgroup
Mm-hmm.
within the Amazigh people called Tinhinan.
Mm-hmm.
Even
Because
within
there
our
is a
national history, there was a queen in the 1500s within the Saadi dynasty who really like built Marrakesh as a capital for the first time. And she was a queen and she ruled
mm-hmm.
for many years. in sort of the interim between her husband dying and her child becoming old enough to rule. And she had the most incredible reputation. She built an incredible reputation for herself for leading international and domestic policy. Where people called her Lalla Auda. So Auda is the return, because she would never basically sit in the palace or in the court, in the royal court. She was always in movement, constantly in touch with the needs of the community and reporting back and working on policy that meets those needs. And so we were stripped away of like this entire wealth of feminist history for a reason. And it's those reasons that I think have triggered a lot of my like consciousness and my activism.
Now, how did your mother react and how did your father react to you, as I quote you, when you became radicalized? How did I want to know how your Jewish family reacted and how your Muslim family reacted, basically.
Yeah, wow. So my father's family is very much kind of like spread all around the world. I grew up with very small contact with them, and I think part of that is they're also navigating like layers of trauma. And I think once I was born, my mom was very strategic about sheltering me from some of that trauma. And my mom's family, I mean, until today, we have a lot of animated conversations, and they keep trying to kind of send me things as if I don't know them. Non-Jewish.
Nasiha. Yeah.
Which is really funny because obviously I grew up in this sort of anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian perspective that just completely erases Israeli and Jewish voices and perspectives. So it's not like I don't know. In fact, I know too much. But I don't fault them because they haven't tried to learn the other side. So I guess I fault them for some things, but not too much.
So when you were growing up, you were more in the Muslim culture then, I guess, like as far as obviously country-wise, but at home, that was kind of the religion that was more prominent in your childhood?
Not at home, but the second I would step out of the house, that's what was assumed, that I would be Muslim. So I'm supposed to
That's the code switching.
like a Muslim woman. But I never accepted that. And also I never believed really while I was growing up. So, and in fact, because I would be meeting a lot of religious extremism outside of the household, then that became, my identity became sort of the contrarian, the one who's pushing against religious organizing all the time and religious arguments. My dad's family is much more secular, and as I said, they're kind of all over the world, and very disconnected from even their like Moroccanness, their sense of national identity, except my dad. My dad is in a way very nationalistic, which always kind of baffled me because I would be like, you're so liberal, but how could you be so nationalistic? Which is my like progressive bias, which we can talk about.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So I find it all very interesting, all very fascinating. Obviously, we're starting at the middle of the story because there would have been this whole story of your parents meeting and getting married and what that would have meant in the society and for them as individuals as well. And there's just so much more to unpack here, but we won't have time to get into all of it. But I can just imagine that there's a lot of conflicting and
what I'll say though is that my parents did get married, had their firstborn, who is my sister, my older sister, and then got divorced and were away for a few years. And then eventually my dad was writing love letters to my mother, and they got back together and had 3 more kids.
Aww. That's so sweet. I love that.
There's hope.
Yeah, that's lovely. And are they still together today?
Yeah, they're
Even
still
with
together. And
your mom in hijab, and your dad's has to accept that because he loves
yeah,
her.
yeah, and it's actually really interesting because my dad also went to Hajj with my mother. It's
Wow.
he cares about.
He really does love her. Okay. How did they even, he must have, you're not allowed to do Hajj if you're not Muslim. Like you're not even, he must have had to hide his Jewish identity.
But he's been hiding it his basically entire life.
Mm.
And so it's really heartbreaking because October 7th was very wounding for me because I think a lot of my work was informed by my experiences of my dad and my dad's stories of persecution and silencing and having to constantly minimize his Jewish and like play down his Jewish identity. And so in many ways, I started doing this work so that he could heal, so that he could
Oh.
um, be okay with his Jewish story. And not only that, as I wanted to kind of create this kind of collective movement in the country where the entire country is okay with its Jewish history and Jewish past. And hopefully, there would be like a domino effect and more people can accept that story because it really is what makes Morocco this kind of magical country.
Mhm.
And I also believe that there is no way we can move forward as a society or as a culture without truly understanding our history, our identities, our core values, in a way, to put it in basic terms, where do we come from and where do we go? And I
Mhm.
think that this question around identity in the Arab world in North Africa has been so toxic because no one's allowed to even ask what our
Exactly.
history
Yeah.
is. And so, how could you innovate? How could you develop? How could you allow for debate and for constructive argumentation without this basic question of who am I and where do I come from? And that's pretty much why I became an existentialist so early because none of it made sense to me. And I just wanted to strip it all away. I wanted to strip away
Mhm.
religion and culture and nationality and everything. And I think in many ways, like having this consciousness of being a Jew in the Arab world strips you of a lot of those things. And watching my father tell and hearing his stories of not just himself, but his communities, the people who nurtured him in the Jewish neighborhood where he grew up, the person who breastfed him and was stripped away of her belonging to Morocco and had to like flee to Israel. His formative relationships, his love relationships when he was like a teenager and a young man. And hearing all of these stories from such a young age, I think was really formative for me and enabled me to question a lot of things around me and almost force myself to strip away all of those identities that people around me told me that I somehow belong to and say, I'm going to build from scratch.
Wow.
And I won't identify as anything until I can rationalize and like logically understand where it comes from. Um, so that meant that I was doing a lot of research throughout middle school and high school, and just being the nerd.
And it was
Um,
within that headspace of really wanting to find yourself, basically, to put it in flippant terms, that you ended up in a very significant relationship, a very important relationship in your life. Tell us about that.
wow. Yes. So I ended up marrying someone who was very progressive on paper, but deeply Islamist and very much pan-Arabist. And he himself had been, I think, radicalized through multiple decades of pan-Arabism and Islamism in the region. someone who grew up in the Gulf and,
Which was super common, super popular. Like it was just like the wave that everybody was riding. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, go
yes,
on.
it was normalized.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we don't have time to go into the history of Wahhabism in the region.
Mm-hmm.
It was very normalized. It was obviously pushed by Saudi Arabia, came as a reaction to the Islamic Republic and the revolution in 79, and Iran basically championing this new story about being the guardians of pure Islam, so claiming this
Yep.
purity or what Muslims should look like or behave like, which threatened Saudi Arabia, and who then, as in a way, to react and to keep their status as guardians of Mecca and Medina and as sort of the strongest country in the Muslim world, they went through a process of radicalization, which Saudi woke up to post 9/11 because of American pressure. And
Mm-hmm.
started to divest from. I mean, speaking of divestment, this is the actual divesting that needs to happen. And so Saudi
Mm-hmm.
started their de-radicalization program since 9/11, which has been really successful and even more successful in the last several years, where you're clearly seeing the fruits of de-radicalization. Women driving starting 2019,
Mm-hmm.
not needing a guardian to travel, the country kind of liberalizing, open up to more tourism, and segregation of genders. So genders at what my friend Mechtaly Najad, who's an Iranian activist, calls gender apartheid. So gender apartheid slowly starting
Well,
to.
I'm gonna push back a little bit because it is true that Saudi Arabia has done a lot of important work with de-radicalization. I wouldn't point to those social things though, especially when it comes to women's issues, because those are nothing more than window dressing. Like for example, when you say women can drive, you're absolutely correct, but they still need a man's permission to get a driver's license. They still need a man's permission to leave the house. You know what I mean? So the guardianship laws are still in place.
Yes.
The social conservatism treatment of women as lesser than is still there, but they are doing some really important things. One of the most, I found one of the most impressive things to be that they removed all the anti-Semitic ahadith from the curriculum in the schools, which is massive. Um, there's other things that they do because they are an absolute monarchy. They obviously don't have free speech and free expression, so they can make strides in ways that maybe we wouldn't necessarily agree with in the West. But they clamp down very strongly on anybody who is supporting Hamas on social media, for example. They do things like that to show that they really are interested in de-radicalization. They obviously hate Islamists and consider them to be terrorists. So everything that you mentioned, I completely agree with, and I'm completely on board, and I totally understand that this has all started with Iran, and which is why I'm glad that hopefully Iran will fall soon and things will start to end with Iran. But just because of the many Saudi women that I'm interacting with all the time, I'm very, you know, conscious of not letting the propaganda of women are so free in Saudi Arabia now. Like that's absolutely not the case quite yet, but things are moving hopefully in that direction.
That would be looking at the region with sort of rose-tinted glasses. So it
Yeah.
wouldn't be clear. What I would like to say, however, though, is that there are real challenges that are posed by radicalism. And so even on your way to de-radicalize, one thing that I hear a lot from my Khaliji friends is, well, you can't do it all like overnight because then that sends a shock to the system in sort of a societal way. And so they try to think up ways to do it over longer periods of time so it can be sustainable. I don't think this intent towards de-radicalization from Saudi or the UAE or Bahrain is out of the goodness of anyone's heart. I don't think they're just all of a sudden like, let's go, women's rights.
Mhm.
I think it's out of need because the Arab
Mhm.
Spring presented some incredible, unprecedented challenges with the extremists, with the Muslim Brotherhood, that the region woke up to.
Absolutely.
A rude
Yeah.
awakening for all these regimes that had emboldened extremism in the region. And then they were faced with extremely capable, well-organized, well-financed organizations that had been building um, social and cultural relationships on the ground with people, with sort of the proletariat, the working classes, the 99%, and doing it in the mosques, obviously, doing it in the poorest neighborhoods across the region. And so these regimes that were in power woke up to the fact that all of a sudden these organizations have become, in a way, much more powerful than the regimes
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
power. And so
Definitely.
this a policy of de-radicalization doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not just pressure by the United States to de-radicalize post 9/11, although that plays a part,
It's to
but
retain their own power.
because if
Mhm.
they don't do it, there will be political coups in the same way that we've observed in Yemen or Egypt or Libya
Across the
or
whole region. Yeah.
you
But
know,
let's go
Libya.
back to this guy now. We got off track.
Well, I think
So
it's
he was,
important to kind of frame that experience for people to really understand what I was dealing with.
yeah. Yeah, for sure.
So, part of the issues is that I went to a very progressive college. I went to Brandeis University for college. And even though I grew up very close to extremism in Morocco and like fully aware of the challenges, I, fell in love with the Obama campaign in 2008. That was when I was still in high school. And I went back to Morocco and I looked at the country differently. So the people who were starting to who were continuing to kind of challenge me on my atheism, I looked at them as, oh, you're just victims of this system. Almost in a way that like was also stripping them away of their agency, because I could have been a victim in the same way to that kind of radicalization. But it was that and falling in love with this idea of hope and pluralism and the progressives will save us all. And those were my spaces, those were my communities. And so I ended up, I think, making up so much more space for other communities that I deemed, marginalized, than for my own self, than for my own identities, than for my own voice. And part of that was, falling in love with a man who is Black presenting, and who's, definitely African, or if he's in the United States, anyone would see him as African American, and who didn't identify as Black or African, really, who identified as Arab. And so
Was he
that,
Somali then?
no, from East Africa, but we're gonna
Okay,
leave.
because are convinced they're not Black, they are Arabs. I'm like, all right, sure.
Yeah, and
You do
that's
you, boo.
totally because of Pan-Arabism, because of
Yeah.
Islam's impact on the region. And in fact, in Sudan, that's why Sudan and South Sudan split apart because, Black people were told that they weren't Arab enough or Muslim enough.
Mhm.
And so, I fell into this relationship in my last year of college, and I, fell in love with his rhetoric in many ways, his words. This was someone who was well versed in legal issues in the legal field, we're gonna say, and I fell in love with this sort of stance for justice. And I was like a social justice warrior from Brandeis, so it made sense in many ways. But it came as a shock to my family, first because I spoke about marriage and a man for the first time when they had always seen me as like hyper independent and super feminist. And it was also because they just realized, like, culturally, we're not going to be on the same wavelength. And I kind of went against the wishes and the advice of everyone and said, no, this is the love of my life. And so we got married very shortly after meeting. And in a crazy turn of events, I actually got married in Doha, Qatar, which is also why I know that country really deeply. So since October 7th, I've been going after Qatari extremism and their sort of emboldening and financing of Hamas.
Can I just ask you what year that was? I wonder if I was there during that time.
It was in 2016, actually. And
No, I'd already left. Okay.
the night of my like legal marriage, I actually bumped into Ismail Hania in a five-star.
Wow.
I immediately like had a panic attack, like ran to my room, and he looked at me like I was, he didn't know I was Jewish, but he looked at me like I was just flesh, like, oh, just looking at me, sizing me up and down, which is not the Muslim virtues and values. But I remember, running into my hotel room and thinking, what am I doing? How did I end up in Islamist territory? But we went on with this basically Sharia law marriage contract. And for years, I tried to make that marriage work, a marriage that was deeply, deeply abusive. I went through a lot, layers of abuse. And I still tried to make it work because the story that I was telling myself was, this is someone who is also from a minority. And if I can just show him that he could never fully belong in this like illusion of Arab nationalism, and if I can just show him that he can sort of free himself from these identity politics and sort of see the region for what it is, then we can eventually like not have any any of what he called the fault lines. So the fault lines, and in any Islamic education teacher will tell you the same. It's we call in Arabic التالوت المحرم, right? So the fault lines, according to him, was we can't discuss politics because I had working and other relationships with Israelis. I was always deeply Zionist, but not in the sense that, you want Palestinians to suffer, but you believe in the right for Jews to live in Israel as their ancestral homeland. And he identified the second fault line as religion, because I was atheist. And the third was, don't talk to me about sexual intimacy, sexual issues, all of
Amazing. How the heck did you guys have a relationship with such three fundamental things?
It's a mystery.
I'm like, with each layer that you're adding on, I'm like, I can't even begin to. First of all, you're a political being, you know what I mean? So the first one, I was already like, okay, deal breaker. But then it just kept getting worse and worse.
Totally. So it was basically, you can exist in this marriage, in this relationship, and we were living in the Gulf. I won't name countries, but we were living in the Gulf, and it was basically, you can't tell people that you have Jewish father or a Jewish story, that you're atheist, that you believe in Israel's right.
Wow. Talk about diminishing yourself.
I mean, in every way possible. In fact, like within 3 months of marriage, my health collapsed. I had severe IBS. I didn't even know what IBS was. For 2.5 years, I couldn't eat normal food. I was basically on baby formula for 6 months because the most basic core parts of my identity were suppressed. And at the same time, it was like, you can't tell people these things, not because I don't love you, but because people will judge me for picking you. People will judge me for picking a Jew. People will judge me for picking a Zionist. People will judge me for picking someone who doesn't identify as Arab. So all of these layers. And then, when it comes to intimacy and all of those other things, I rationalized them. I said, oh, this is someone who grew up in the Gulf. This is someone who grew up in a culture that does not encourage any conversation. And so I was patient. Unfortunately, I learned a lot of patience from my mother. And because, as Muslim women, mom was taught to suppress everything, to keep it all inside, to struggle through pain and never show a sign that she is going through anything. And so, these are a lot of things that I'm constantly working through and kind of finding my voice to work through, privately and publicly. And so for a few years, I basically pushed it all in and tried to exist in a relationship that negated all of my basic needs. And eventually we get to a point where he developed these political career ambitions that were going to put me in really great risk. And I remember telling him, you're going to get killed and I'm going to be raped and killed. So I don't think I can allow my body to be in this position. And so a lot of disagreements followed. But ultimately, it was really because I was pushing a lot of the conversations around his own healing, really, his own acceptance of conversations around intimacy and sexuality, and around kind of undoing a lot of problems that you grew up with in the region. And I was basically divorced as an absentee while I was outside of the country in the early months of COVID. I had to stand in a Sharia law court to defend my rights, which, by the way, did not see me for having any mixed identity or any sort of foreign culture, anything. I was basically judged on the basis of being a Muslim woman, standing before a Sharia law court after I had been stripped away of everything overnight. So much, going through so much dehumanization that I have a lot of crazy stories, but one of them is, coming back to the only home I knew in the Arab world in the Gulf, and, finding my clothes, my belongings in trash bags, because it was almost like I wasn't just not even a roommate. I was just, I don't know, an enemy or someone that he just kind of used for a specific kind of political and social posturing. But it was never really his wife. I was not treated with basic decency or basic humanity. And so it was a lot to work through, just kind of being shaken up to see the reality for what it is. And it was really transformative for me, because I think that whole time, ever since I was a kid, I worked towards interfaith dialogue, bridging the gaps, holding spaces and creating these safe spaces of dialogue between Muslims and Jews. In the UAE, I started a business, a jewelry business, actually, that I'm wearing. You can see here, it says, Wala ghaliba illallah, which is the mantra of the Nasrid dynasty from Granada. So all of these beautiful tokens of coexistence and pluralism in the region. And I started this business to do the interfaith work in ways that were entrepreneurial, because you can't start an NGO in the UAE. And actually the reason for why that is the case is because most NGOs would just be venues for Islamist ideology and recruitment. So they're totally banned since the Arab Spring. And so I had to find all of these creative ways to continue my mission. But it wasn't until I woke up to that reality of having given everything to that marriage and to this man, and in a way to an ideology that I didn't even realize that I was in. and then seeing that I had given too much. I had sacrificed my own life, my own agency, my own body, my own mental health to exist in this situation. And that, in a way, kind of showed me what it has been like for both women and Jews in the region every time there was Islamist rule, because there were cases that were slightly different and more moderate and more interesting, but generally that's what it was. You're basically kind of subhuman. You are stripped of basic dignity and humanity. And I also woke up to this very, what I call today, like a very toxic progressive idea that if we just get people to talk to each other, everything will be fixed. Which is what I dedicated my life to interfaith dialogue. And I really tried to create those safe spaces, but they're not safe if there's no authenticity, if there's no full truth. We have to show up as who we are, and we build from there. Because if it's not truthful and authentic and from a place of true alignment with self, then we're not building, we're pretending. And I think a lot of interfaith dialogue across the world is a lot of pretending and like making people feel good about themselves, not actually solving for sustainable peace, for Israeli-Palestinian understanding, for inclusion and solutions that can last.
100% agree with that. Chama, we have only scheduled an hour with you, but I've just been listening to you so intently, and I just realized the time has gone. I'm wondering if you are able to just maybe take 15 more minutes to take some Q&A from the group. Okay, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
I would be happy to, of course.
Okay, great. Cecile, thank you for raising your hand. Oh, and Sarah, if anybody else has any questions, please raise your hand. For the next 15 minutes, we're going to pick Chama's brain with some questions and comments. So please be prepared so that we can not waste too much time. Okay, Cecile, you're first. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Chama and Yasmine. This is very meaningful for me. I am Jewish Moroccan. I spent all my childhood summers in Morocco. My family still has my grandparents' apartment in Casablanca, and I still have family in Marrakesh. Moroccan culture is really big part of my life. My nephew just got married. We did a henna as part of that. You can still see that. So just to position myself here, until October, I'm going to say October 12th, I identified as very progressive in every respect. And now I don't know where I belong anymore. I can say that I grew up with, my parents' Moroccan mentality, being taught that I shouldn't go out there and be loud about my Jewish identity. They never said to hide it, but I had to be discreet about it. And so my whole life, I've always been very discreet about my Jewish identity. And now I feel that I cannot stay silent anymore. But I haven't found my voice. I'm still looking for my voice. So I will take the opportunity to say that women like you and Yasmine truly give me hope that we can find a way out of the world we live in. And I hang on to every word you say, every word Yasmine says. So I want to thank you for your moral courage and moral clarity. So to my question, one of the things that I think has not been focused on as much as I would have expected, as we're seeing what's happening in the world, what I consider to be the hateful, libelous lies, the inconceivable inversions of reality. one of the things that we're seeing on campuses on North American is students posting what I consider to be pro-Hamas, pro-terrorist charters, you know, to condemn the Zionist or denounce or fight the Zionist entity by all means necessary. But there's one point in particular that I think a lot of people don't understand well, which is denouncing normalization in all its forms. And I think a lot of people don't fully understand or appreciate how destructive anti-normalization laws are. So I wonder if you can comment on your experience with that, having lived in the Middle East and as part of your work. Is that something that you've engaged with? Thank you.
Yeah, totally. So first I want to give you some language to kind of speak about this more. So the opposite of normalization is criminalization, right? So criminalizing and punishing any relationship with Israel, with Israelis, and with Israeli organizations and companies or companies that have branches or invest in Israel. Now, this is not new. This is not new. You know, growing up in Morocco, and you shared your beautiful Moroccan Jewish story with us. Thank you so much for sharing your story, and Mazal Tov for the henna. But
Thank you.
growing up in Morocco, for me, like in the early 2000s, which, by the way, same time, there was this crazy wave of Islamist insurgency in the country in 2003. There was a terrorist attack in May 2003 that shocked the country, really sent shockwaves across the country, and it targeted like secular and expat spaces as well as Jewish spaces. I'm sure you know about this, Cecile. And
Chama, I'll take the opportunity to say that we have very good friends who live in Montreal who lost a brother to one of the terrorist attacks at that time. Yeah, so what you're mentioning is very, very close to home.
Yeah, I wasn't far away, so I remember seeing remains of organs, of brains, and this is something that has been coming back for me since October 7th, because we as activists feel like we're obviously being spoken over by people who have never come close to a terrorist attack and haven't lost any loved ones. And so around that same time, what I remember is a lot of these boycott campaigns happening. And I've had not the privilege, but maybe the misfortune of doing a lot of work on de-radicalization over the years, and finding that a lot of these boycott campaigns are actually launched and funded by Islamist organizations. So there's a direct link to BDS and to all of this like divestment culture to Islamist ideology and organizations who obviously want to dismantle democracy in the West and also replace governments that are more moderate and regimes that are more moderate in the region. And the reason I'm saying governments and regime, because it depends on the state, and you know, each country is different. Now, what do I think? I think that any conversation that starts with let's criminalize relationships with Israel and Jews is inevitably toxic and only leads to further separation, will not solve any crisis. Like this is how we need to frame the conversation. We need to dismantle BDS. We need to dismantle this criminalization. We need to encourage more normalization. And let me tell you my own experience with normalization as a recovering progressive, is what I call myself, who ended up doing a lot of normalization work and regional integration work in the Middle East and in the Gulf. So for me, I had a lot of problems with the sort of state-to-state Arab-Israeli normalization as an activist coming into the space. Because as an activist, I was in the minority trying to push for a better understanding of Israel and the Jewish people in the Middle East. But then once these states formed this relationship, it did come from nowhere. There was a lot of buildup leading to the peace deals that were signed in 2020, known as the Abraham Accords. But in that moment, I was living in Dubai, and I remember struggling. Like, I got invited to certain spaces as someone who works on interfaith dialogue in January 2020, and then in March. And I was seeing Saudi and UAE championing this work. And I was so not just confused by why specifically Saudi was showing up to that space for the first time, because I had been to every like Muslim Jewish interfaith conference ever, but I was resisting, and my resistance came from my progressive values and identities, because in progressive spaces in America, I was told not to trust these regimes whatsoever, not to do any work with them, not to, in a way, normalize them because they're anti-democratic. And in many ways for me, that was like, it took some time for me to actually reconcile. So, and to think, no, this is for the greater good, because if we don't work on normalization, what we have is a big problem known as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? And this big problem has taken like a big boulder, basically, of multiple rocks, and each rock is a different ideology. This is how I think about it. So there's a rock of pan-Arabism, there is a rock of Islamism, there is a rock of progressivism, and they're all kind of interacting together. So you have to dismantle one by one. The reason why normalization was helpful and why it helped me kind of revisit and go where my resistance and my discomfort was because it was dismantling the pan-Arabism part of the equation. The Islamism and the de-radicalization was going to be a lot more long-term, because it doesn't happen overnight. And that is part of why these deals were signed. But the pan-Arabism sort of rock is huge. So beginning to normalize this relationship allows for the region to have avenues of dialogue so that people can sit down and say, okay, we're dismantling this problem first, and then this one, and then this one, eventually, so we can get to just long-term resolutions for Palestinians and Israelis to live either side by side or to live in separate countries, side by side, whatever it is. I think it's too far in the discussion today to say one state, two states, because the reality is majority of Israelis know that the majority of Palestinians have been radicalized through the years and through decades, and don't have trust that they can coexist, they can live side by side. And a majority of Palestinians who have been radicalized to think Israelis only want to be, just want to be the only community here, don't feel like they can trust a peace process to begin with. So there is no trust building without normalization, because we can't do any work, and we can't do any work because we're not talking to each other. I mean, one thing that I said in that video, the Facts for Peace video, when I say I'm a Jewish and Zionist, I'm also a Muslim and Zionist, is imagine if both my parents weren't talking to each other. It's impossible. Like, sure, they have different values, they have different narratives, they have different realities, but if you want them to coexist in a relationship, both narratives have to be honored and have to be spoken, and they might clash a lot, but we need to be pragmatic about resolutions. But part of the pragmatism is getting as many countries in the Arab world involved in a process of normalization, and then saying, okay, now that Israel and our regime, our countries, have a working relationship, we can sit down and work through the issues. And I can tell you so many incredible stories of transformation that I saw myself through the work of normalization over the years here and in the UAE and in Bahrain and in the region and in Saudi. I was in Saudi last year. Work that is necessary, because let me wrap up with this. What criminalization or the anti-normalization movements do is that they increase extremism. And with increased extremism on any side, you are taking away our very possibility of having dialogue and having constructive conversations towards solutions. And so why should anyone believe in that? That's the problem. If anyone believes in BDS, they are part of the problem. They are extremists, and if they don't know it, they should at the very least know that they are strengthening extremism in the region. Because the reality is, Israel is not going to go anywhere. Israelis and Jews aren't going anywhere, and Palestinians aren't going anywhere. So we have to work together to create solutions, and we can only do that with, like we said earlier, honest conversations and in an environment of trust. That's what normalization does. Creates the trust that we need to get to solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Chama. We've got just a couple minutes left. So Sarah, we've got two Sarahs. So the first Sarah that put her hand up, you go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Yasmine. I think you're amazing. Anyway, but I'll go quickly to my question. Also, Chama,
Thank you.
it's really cool to talk to you. You're also quite amazing too. And you're both amazing. And now I'm okay, gonna stop doing that. So I wanted to ask you that there's a lot of like okay, where do I begin with my question? Just get into it. So the self-censorship that you talked about coming from your dad, that I think is maybe very resonant for a lot of Middle Eastern Jews. There's some Middle Eastern Jews that are in my life that I care very much about their safety and well-being. And I just want to ask you about that and help. I'm a Ashkenazi Jew, and I struggle so much with self-censorship because it feels like there's this like constant undoing of our history. Like, do I have to become a geneticist to prove like where my ancestry's from? Like, it feels like an upward climb, but I also feel like right now what's playing out against Jews is I'm very focused on Middle Eastern Jews right now because there's a complete denialism of their history to fit a certain narrative. So I guess I want to talk to you about that disconnect between like the like Cecile was talking about, like this finding your voice, but also like helping people who've had to be self-censored for their survival too in more recent history. So I hope that's question is making sense.
Yeah, totally. I'll respond in a bit. Maybe we take a couple more questions and I'll respond to all of them. And maybe for the sake of gender equality, let's get a question from a man.
Okay, so okay, great. How about Tochi? You're next.
Oh, hey, Yasmine, what's up? Shama, thanks for speaking. So my question is, how do you find out which sort of Islamist groups in general are funding BDS? I'm just curious, like how do you is this still some sort of like in-depth knowledge? Like how do you just go to Google and see like I'm just curious, because you did mention it and I agree with what you're saying, but how does one sort of do their own digging? Thank you.
Third question, and I'll respond.
Okay, do you have time to keep going? Because there's two more questions. Okay. Ira, you're next.
Oh,
I'm going in order. Instead of going in order of gender, I'm going in order of first come, first serve. Go ahead,
okay.
Ira.
Thanks for serving me. So beautiful talk, fascinating. I really resonated with your discussion of the inauthenticity of interfaith dialogue, which someone described as a mutual security pact between religions against criticism. And it reminded me of my first time in the Soviet Union 40 years ago, when endlessly we would have to drink these toasts to peace and friendship between peoples. And then I met with Ukrainian dissidents, And I propose toast, real peace and real friendship between real people. It was the exact same point of the inauthenticity of all this official dialogue or sponsored, manipulated dialogue. So yeah, I feel on that one. My suggestion question, which if you may want to answer or may want to some other day deal with, you've noticed the link de-radicalization and normalization. The two of them definitely go together, and their opposites definitely go together. I would add another set of related terms, modernization and westernization. Those go together with each other, and they go together with de-radicalization and with normalization. And then finally, for want of a better word, a bit sarcastically, recolonization, meaning against this, what's called decolonization of the mind, which means, in fact, getting rid of the superior layers of civilization and going back to as much primitivism as you can get your hands on in order to undermine the modern and civilized world. And here as a Jew, I'll say we Jews got a lot from the Persian Empire and what we learned from it, from the Roman Empire, from the Hellenic empires, and from the diasporas that we joined. We let our minds be colonized, we made them better, and we in turn spread ourselves on the world as well. It was mutually beneficial. So I would say recolonization in a polemical way is perhaps the most basic thing needed to overcome this primitivizing instinct.
So do you have a question, Ira?
That's sort of it. What would you do with those last terms, the modernization, westernization, decolonization? And you may or may not want to, I mean, if you want to deal with that another day, time's running short. So that's.
Sounds good. So the first question I think that Sarah posed was on Jewish identity and how do you deal with like self-censorship? How do you deal with this like, in a way, traumatic urge to go into hiding? So not something I don't relate to. I relate to it very deeply. But I would say that I think the first thing you have to do is you have to heal because you have layers of trauma in your body. And when you go into hiding, you're just responding to the trauma. And when you're responding to the trauma, you're not acting in full agency and you're not acting, I mean, spiritually even speaking, you're not really like reaching your potential in this lifetime. Like your soul is here to do some work and you're not really doing that work. All you're doing is you're kind of containing or catering to the traumas that you carry. So I think all that's on the spiritual basis, which is really important for me because that's something I learned over the years. At the end of the day, no matter how much you hide as a Jew, it's not going to be enough to protect you. We have learned this lesson over and over again through Jewish history. So what you must do is you heal yourself and then you accept yourself as a Jew. And I recommend an incredible book, actually. Again, my existentialism is going to show, but Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a book on anti-Semitism, and it's just called Anti-Semitism and the Jew. The Jew and the anti-Semite, right? And it goes into these portraits of different types of anti-Semites. And it also kind of really shows the layers of internalized anti-Semitism, which is really incredible. The book has received some criticism because Jean-Paul Sartre himself isn't a Jew, but I think it's really, really fascinating to learn about these different portraits. So one that comes to mind is the democratic anti-Semite. So very much like using the language of progressive values and believing in democracy and progressive values, but is someone who's unable to see a Jew for what he or she or they really are, right? For what the Jew really is, because they, as a democratic person, they inherently reject this intersection of Jewish identity with an ethnic identity, right? That itself challenges the foundation of how a democratic person is built, right? Now, the other interesting, in my view, that's the first interesting portrait. The second interesting portrait is the inauthentic Jew. And it's part of why I speak a lot about authenticity, because Jean-Paul Sartre said that the inauthentic Jew flees his own Jewishness because he can't deal with it, because it's actually really heavy as a responsibility. And so it's up to everyone, I'm not just speaking to you, Sarah, but it's up to everyone to shoulder what they can in a way, right? If it's very difficult and the trauma is too much for your body that you cannot show up in the most authentic version of you, I'm not going to tell you to change. Obviously, do what you need to feel protected and safe first, because that is your first need as a human being. But it's very, very hard for us collectively to solve for the effective understanding of what Jewishness means. And I fight this fight all the time as someone who's a patrilineal Jew. It's very hard to teach these things if we're not living it ourselves. And in many ways, sometimes we live it in one community, don't live it in another, because we are afraid of what the repercussions will be. But I think that we can't really, we can't be seen if we're not seeing ourselves for who we are, and if we don't communicate what we see in ourselves. And it's another layer of existentialism, right? How others see you and how you react to others seeing you. I think that's really, really important. Yeah, so I don't know if I answered your question fully.
But you got a lot. Thank you. Yeah, I asked like 17 questions in one question, I think. So, but thank you. And I appreciate you so much.
That was the core of the question.
Yes, thank you.
The second question was, where do you find these reports about BDS connections to Islamism? I'll tell you the reason why I said that story about being a young person in Morocco and seeing the boycotts. It's very it's physical. You're handed these slips that say boycott these companies because they have relationships with Israel. And who are you handed these slips by? They're Islamists. It's not going to fool me because I grew up in Morocco. They have the Islamist beard. They have this sort of token of piousness in their foreheads to signal that they pray all the time, etc. And you also know that they belong to specific organizations. And I've had experiences with these Islamist organizations over the years. But you mentioned Google, definitely a starting point. You'll see that there has been a trend, specifically in democratic spaces and progressive spaces over the last 10, 15 years, to water down these extremist organizations, not really show the public what they really are. I'll give you an example. There's an organization called DAWN, Democracy for the Middle East and North Africa, which is incorporated in Washington, D.C. Originally founded by Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who worked for the Washington Post, right? And it just came out last week that an editor of the Washington Post was being paid by an Islamist organization. So a lot of these things will be uncovered in due time. But look into DAWN as an organization and see for yourself, who are the countries they're going after in their reports? The countries who are pursuing, again, moderation, and like Ira said, modernization. They're not going after the Islamic Republic, despite all of their abuses. They're not going after Qatar, for example. They're not going after Bashar al-Assad and the Assad's regime in Syria. They've never gone after the extremists in Kuwait, for example. So that's what you'll see. You'll see these nuances that they are so centered around the de-radicalizing and normalizing countries in the Middle East because they have an agenda, because they want to replace the regimes that sit in power there. And because they platform or they use this rhetoric of democracy in places like DC, they're not flagged. Because people think people in the West think they're supporting dissidents who want democratic values in the Middle East and North Africa. So that's their strategy of concealment. But once you start going a little bit deeper, you see the connections. So I hope I answered your question. Now, on the question about modernization and Westernization, and was it anti-decolonization or recolonization? What? Okay, so we'll just roll with that because you're muted. Wow. So I think this is going to go back to how Yasmine introduced me, which is something that I'm really passionate about, is how do you bridge Western and Eastern values, something that I grew up constantly trying to do myself. And this is something I see the Middle East struggling with and struggling to transcend, to build Islam who are trying to take us back to the Middle Ages, if not worse, and to, in a way, cater to the needs, the problems, the challenges of the modern world. And it's a very tough balance. It's such a tough balance. You'll have political parties in the Middle East and North Africa called after this goal, right? Like named after modernization and tradition, because they're trying to strike this balance. Now, I want to illustrate this with a story. I was in Bethlehem and Ramallah, so in Palestinian territories, about 10 days ago, and I met these really lovely young Palestinian women entrepreneurs who are trying to do so much to fight a lot of the conditions that they're navigating, conditions that come from social systems, religious systems, cultural norms and values, but also socioeconomic problems, because the Palestinian Authority is deeply corrupt and doesn't allow for socioeconomic transcendence for your average entrepreneur, right? And they have limited freedom of mobility, obviously, because they're in the West Bank, and they are just challenged with so many intersections of problems. And at the same time, the reason why they were really fascinating to sit with and have conversations with is because they had not just Palestinian identity, but they were half Palestinian, half something else, half European, half American. I'm not going to go into details because I don't want to endanger their lives. Because unfortunately, when you speak to Palestinians, and when they speak to you with honesty, they can be lynched for their opinions. But what was so fascinating about these young women is that they were trying to bridge Eastern and Western values, because that's what they were. They spoke with American and British and European accents. They spoke about third culturalism. They spoke about how do you relate to all of these different cultures at the same time. And you happen to also be Palestinian living in the West Bank. And, you happen to have another passport, another identity, another parent, and you want to transcend, but the system is not allowing you to. So I'm seeing them, they're thinking about how do we create this really cool brand or company or, fashion capsule. But how do you do these things effectively if you're surrounded by a system of individuals and leaders who don't want you to? Because that perspective itself really challenges the foundation on which they rule, right? They rule through a very singular-minded, reductionist, essentialist narrative of what the Middle East and the Muslim world should look like. So you can't fight that as one young entrepreneur, let alone a woman. Very difficult to fight that. Now, on recolonization, let me tell you.
Let me just give my accurate wording. Decolonization, getting rid of the glorification of decolonization as the highest value.
Yeah. I'll tell you, I'm going to be very honest with you. Here's the problem that everyone neglects in the region is that colonialism, and it's not just European, but multiple manifestations in the region, has broken people. There's a deep wound associated with colonialism. And that's why consciousness goes out the window when Israel is framed as a colonial state. It's very hard for people to start even through system. So that's and so Israel is the last stronghold of colonialism in the Middle East. Then in these people's consciousness, it's the wound. It's the wound that keeps wounding. And so it's very, very, very hard for people to even like accept this terminology. And that's why I think we have to think beyond what we have as existing paradigms and terms and terminology. But if you ask me personally for my opinion, I believe in collective consciousness. I believe that everyone is worthy of deep belonging and belonging based on true authenticity. I believe that everyone is deserving of dignity and human rights. And I want to see that for people. But we live in a sort of decolonized, post-imperial setup of nation states that are being challenged through technology today. So this is the time, this is the time. Antonio Gramsci says this is the time for the evil monsters to come. When we're going between old paradigms and new ones, that's when the monsters come to the surface. Our monsters today are the extremists. They're progressive extremists in the West and regressive extremists in the East. And we have to deal with both and create moderates across the board who are willing to do this work of what? Belonging. How do we reshape the conversation around how we as human beings belong, not just to states, but to one another? And how do we realize that we're all just one race, for God's sake? And we should be working towards human transcendence, towards innovation. And by the way, the only examples that we have across the history of human civilization of when we had this transcendence, this innovation, this cultural progress, this cultural richness is through context of pluralism, of inclusion, of the policies that enable for people to work together, the policies of normalization, not criminalization. If I can't meet you and talk to you, I can't exchange ideas, I'm not challenged, I stay in my bubble and I don't learn anything and you don't learn anything. So we can't merge, we can't fuse. Culture is constantly fused and merging and being redefined and remixed, right? So the greatest enemies to human civilization are the ones who don't want us to mix and to talk to each other.
Thanks. I think we agree.
Thank you so much, Chama. There's still a couple more questions. Are you open to taking 2 more questions, or are you exhausted?
Just because it is Shabbat and I have to go.
Okay.
To join the
All right.
Very late. I got flagged.
Okay. You know what? This is a treat because this is one of my most favorite people is asking her question now. Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you so much for that, Yasmine. Hi. I really appreciate you talking to us, Chama. I appreciate you waiting for this last question. You've been talking about interfaith dialogue. You also talked about your husband, who was an extremist, and how, to the detriment of your own health, you are trying to save him. I did the exact same thing. If you listen to my story, it's very similar, very progressive on paper, very Islamist, extremist, to the point that I lost an eye to him because I was trying not to, it's very traumatic. So you talk about all of these interfaith dialogues and how we have to honor each other and honor authenticity. I'm just wondering, where do you draw the line? Because where I come from, there's no moderate Muslim. Moderate Muslims are just waiting for the chance to come out and become Islamists and extremists and take over the world. I'm from Iran, by the way. So that whole country is taken hostage by these moderate Muslims who want to export Sharia law, to the whole world. Shiism is the true form of Islam. And to me, when you talk about interfaith dialogue, I appreciate it, I understand it. But to me, that resistance of talking to Islamists and Muslims and trying to distinguish, like, there's no distinction for me. It's both the same. So I'm just wondering, where do you draw the line? Moderate Muslims are Muslims who do not practice, because they have never come out of the 7th century, based on my experience. They're still stuck there. How do you suggest we do that interfaith dialogue? How do I speak to Muslims? Because my concern is not the Jews, it's not the Christians, it's the Muslims who want to kill me for being an ex-Muslim and for being a rebellious woman. How do I start that conversation with the people of my own faith that don't want me to exist? And then I can think about how I can reach out and talk to other faiths, if that makes any question. And again, it makes any sense. And I'm really, really appreciative of your time. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think the first thing is you shouldn't be wasting your time / giving away your energy and sacrificing your body and mental health for the sake of changing someone's opinion. I think that's completely unsafe and really toxic and non-sustainable. You can build certain communities and kind of share your opinions, and whomever wants to join your community. I think about it in very much like Noah's Ark sort of vision. You build an ark, you build your space, and then if people want to join, yalla, you're welcome. But if they don't, and they just want to kill you, you have the ability to steer your ark in a different direction and continue to be safe. And the reason why I'm saying this is because as women, and especially women from the region, we are conditioned to give space to others more and to their needs more than our own. Now, the conversation about who's a moderate, who's not, when you speak about Iran and all these closeted extremists, is how I'll call them, that's strategic. Iran has been pursuing this policy for a long time. They do it really well, not just in Iran, they do it in the US. And they've been successful at doing it across college campuses, right? Yeah. And so just because they're closeted extremists doesn't mean you have to constantly give them a chance or give them any chance. Just don't put yourself at risk. There is something to be said about episodes of moderate Islam that did flourish in some parts of the Middle East. I mean, Andalusia is an example where you had specific dynasties who, in terms of policy, were moderate. And I think there is an interest in that kind of policy making in some countries in the Gulf, like the UAE today. And if you go to the UAE, you'll see these moderate values showing up. Like, you'll see that secular people can have conversations with religious people. You see that you can wear whatever you want. You see that there is this beautiful community of different cultures that can kind of coexist, but they are also being challenged by those who don't want this vision. They don't want it to see the light of day, and so part of this question I think that we're solving for is a deeper question, which is how come across the Middle East and North Africa, moderates don't have a chance to be moderates, right? They don't have the ability to nurture moderate opinions and moderate communities. And they've traditionally had to flee. They're either exiled, so not by choice, or they have to flee also not by choice. And so the answer to that is obviously non-moderate regimes and communities and interpretations of Islam that have been extremely toxic and damaging, that went after any one reformist that showed up in any community. They would be hung or they would be ostracized. But I think a deeper layer of this is two communities, women and Jews. Because wherever women and Jews are threatened, there is no space for moderation. There is no space for moderate opinions. And that's happening across the board globally, by the way. You're, I'm sure, not new to this news report, but whatever women's rights and Jewish rights are being challenged or stripped away, that's where you have the most extremism. And unfortunately, the more of this extremism happens, the less powers we have in these ecosystems to balance out the extremism, right? If all women are suppressed and suffocated, and Jews have been forced to flee the land, then who's going to balance out the policy making? Nobody, whether it's in democratic or non-democratic systems. So an example of a non-democratic Muslim dynasty that was really moderate and incredibly progressive is the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt 1,000 years ago, who built incredible Muslim spaces with like Stars of David deeply embedded into them, who worked closely with the Jewish and the Christian communities. And guess what? They were Shiite, but they were Shiite ruling over a Sunni majority area. So they had to consolidate these very strong relationships with the Christian and the Jewish communities of Egypt at the time. And so when we talk about moderates, we have to talk about minorities, because minorities keep states moderate and regimes and policy making moderate. And the second we lose our minorities, and look for yourself what happened in the Middle East in the last 75 years to 100 years is an emptying of the minorities from the region, which only serves the two extremist ideologies we spoke about: Pan-Arabism, consolidated in the 60s through Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Islamism, consolidated in the last few decades.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Chama. That, as I was right. See, it was a treat. She always has the best questions. I wanted to add to that as well, because I hopefully you'll watch Sarah's story, because I interviewed her on this channel as well. But Sarah's speaking from a place of trauma that is similar to the trauma that you described of Jewish people, which is trust. You know, after how many times do these people have to try and kill you before you finally like, okay, Maya Angelou told me to believe people when they tell me who they are the first time, you know, and this has been like, you know, way past the expiry date of when I should have stopped trusting. And so it's really difficult to reach both the Israeli people now who are traumatized after October 7th, and probably so many other instances before, and also Iranian people like Sarah, who have been traumatized by the Islamic regime, who are currently being traumatized by the Islamic regime, and so many other people around the world who fit into that same category. So it is all about trust, and it is a very, very difficult thing to do. But I did want to plug an organization here that I'm the co-founder of and co-director of, and it's called the Clarity Coalition. And I co-founded it with a Muslim man, and we do have lots of Muslims in our coalition. We also have Christians and Jews and Hindus and atheists and everybody else. But what's most meaningful is that it is co-directed and co-founded by a Muslim man and an ex-Muslim woman. It is really difficult, Sarah, but it's the step that we have to take. You know, it really is the step that we have to take in order to move forward. The Quran, we didn't talk about this, but the Quran tells Muslims not to trust Jews. It tells Muslims that Jews are liars. They're going to go back on their word. You can't trust them, blah, blah, blah. And so they have that in their head as like divine. We cannot trust Jews because Allah told us not to. So like, regardless of what I see in the world, regardless of the reality, I'm just not going to trust them because Allah told me not to. And that's what prevents any progress, right? The ones who are sticking to their religious edicts and the ones who are taking their Quran literally, they're the ones that are preventing this from going forward. And so what we learn from that is because they're so unwilling to trust their neighbors, things cannot progress. Things will never progress. And so we don't want to be like that. You know, we have to be better than that. And to say, we open the space. And I loved your arc analogy, Chama, because you're not like opening the door wide open and saying, come on in, but you know, you're gently and carefully and slowly and step by step and fully informed, you know, trying to find your way to that trust and take your time.
We're gonna be Yasmine's arc.
What was that?
We're all gonna be in your arc, Yasmine.
Yes. I hope so. I love you all. I really do. If only we were in the ark and if only we procreated. Wow. I mean, what a great world we could create.
Thank you so much, Yasmine. Thank you all for
Thank
joining.
you.
Actually, I do
Thank
have
you.
some side.
Yes, just before you go, tell us how we can support you. I know somebody in the comments asked here, but I'd love for you to tell everybody how we can support your amazing work that you're doing, Chama.
Thank you so much for that question. I think as activists, we never think about how we can get support. We're always just supporting everyone. So I really appreciate the question. Definitely reach out to me on email. This is a small enough group that I would love to be in touch. Again, on Mechtaly@gmail.com. I do work a lot of things. I work a lot on radicalization. I work a lot on dialogue and reading spaces for conversation and dialogue. I do a lot of cultural events as well that show Jewish and pluralistic identities from the region from more of a cultural and interesting perspective. I also run a small think tank institute called the Emma Lazarus Institute for Liberty and Tolerance, bridging the gaps between the Arab moderates and the democratic West. If you are interested in kind of staying in touch with that work, we do a lot of briefings. We do a lot of work with different organizations to try to kind of bridge these gaps and to work more towards normalization and regional integration. Because what I'm solving for is a deeply integrated Israel in the region with positive relationships across the board, where Israel can be a force of good, much more than it is. And if you're interested in that work and you want to be in touch, please send me an email. And what else? And stay in touch. Follow me on Instagram. It's Millennial More. And I look forward to building partnerships and coalitions with all of you. And Yasmine, I'd love to speak about the Clarity organization because we have
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Wonderful. And for anyone that didn't get an opportunity to ask Chama their question, she very graciously shared her email address. So you can go ahead and contact her directly. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And a huge thank you so much, Chama, for giving us so much more of your time than I had asked for. I really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
I'm a dork. I love good questions.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you so much. That was very gracious. Take care, everyone. Bye.
After hearing all that, you might be left wondering, what can I do? How can I help? Well, this is why I created a nonprofit called Free Hearts, Free Minds. We are the only organization dedicated exclusively to helping these free thinkers. We empower them with our programs and supportive community, lifting them up so they can heal, speak out, and begin to make positive changes, not just in their own lives, but within the broader community around them. If this is a cause that resonates with you and you want to make a difference, one way to do that is by donating to Free Hearts, Free Minds. Because not enough people care about this cause, we need people like you to help fuel this change. You can donate via our website, freeheartsfreeminds.com. Thank you. Every dollar you donate makes a difference.